I guess there's complicated systems that occur naturally in businesses and etc., which are based on dynamics. I like discrete event simulations, digital twins. These sorts of things are very process mining is one of my big things that I always hit Alan Morrison up with. Like, why don't RDFL graphs have time as a first class citizen? Why can't they handle process mining? Which is just a way of looking at the world by reconstructing control flows.
That's very reasonable, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a lot of reasonableness in the approach, isn't there?
If you were to take a look at like Blazegraph and what have you, they extend way beyond the quad.
Yeah.
Well, I'm actually even worse than that. I'm on Vatical Type DB. I've gone way past RDFL. Sorry about that.
I'm sure.
Because I'm looking for a much more of a functional description. And I'm pushing their reasoning engine to go beyond deduction. We want calculation and all sorts of things added together.
Yeah. It sounds like good stuff, Brett. I want to welcome some other people. This is Alan. Hi, Doug. Thanks for joining us today. Jess, I don't believe we've met. Do you want to just introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Jess Singer. I'm with Semantic Arts. I'm a relatively new ontologist. I joined in September 2021.
And she's up in Montreal with me.
Yes.
Oh, sounds good. I see Dave's on the line as well.
Yeah, I just decided to turn off my video because I'm borrowing our office manager's hotspot, and we're going to run through his whole data plan here in no time.
Okay, sounds good.
Hi, Dave.
Hey, Brett, how are you?
So,
yeah, good, thanks.
Dave and I talked about just an informal session today because I believe the guy that was going to present on the Microsoft IoT ontology wasn't able to join. So instead of that, we've got Brett Forbes, who is going to help us stir the pot today. And talk about alternatives to the mainstream RDF stack, et cetera. And so in a larger conversation, maybe what we could do today is talk about, what should we be adding to the mix here in terms of the Estes Park group? Those of you who've been visiting for the past months, what would you like to see that you haven't seen? And are there case studies we should be aware of that you've come across that maybe we haven't published on? At the end of the month, we'll be having an event that's case study centric, and we're going to have quite a few interesting people presenting. So always want to add more to the mix there. So it's an informal discussion. So Dave, I wondered if you had any introductory thoughts on that subject?
Yeah, I mean, my main introductory thought, and then I'll let Brett run with it. We had the Data-Centric Architecture Forum running for several years. Last year was virtual. This year we decided to split it, and there's a virtual session the end of February, as Alan said, is mostly case studies. It's mostly why should you become data-centric, but we still want to have an in-person live conference right now at the end of May. I hope we're out of COVID by then. And it's really meant to be more practitioner focused. I just want people to, we've identified 10 problems that really have to be solved well to have a truly data-centric architecture. And they're no surprise, but they're these things that we've solved with application code and in silos in the past that we now have to say, how would we generalize that and put it in the architecture? And there are things like, fine-grained authorization, or, how do you manage validation, consistency, entity relationships, even, generalizing model-driven development or visualization, all those kinds of things. So I'd love to have the next couple of sessions help us find people that want to present on that, get them ready for May, all that kind of stuff. But
Yeah,
that's my main thing.
yeah. So feeding folks who are interested and versed in what we want to do in May. That's definitely a good suggestion.
Yep.
And one of the reasons I thought Brett would be interesting to add to the mix here is because he has been using TypeDB, and he's porting, as I understand it, just to the Graphql solution. And Brett, we've got a lot of folks here who are open source oriented, and you use the proprietary stuff, but I think what you're doing is pretty leading edge. You want us to sort of give us a thumbnail sketch of what it involves and how it should be in the mix?
I will preface my remarks with saying, of all the RDFL schemas that I've come across, I've got great respect for what the semantic arts people have done, and for Dave's leadership in modeling. I'm a big believer in modeling the skeleton of the thing and fleshing together the meat of it with the taxonomies, much like Dave does, having a shall we say, a skeletal type model. So that a lot of what semantic arts represents in the RDFL world, I'm a big believer and admirer of. And so that was one of the reasons why I'm gathering a group of people on Graphql TypeDB to port across the semantic arts gists. And that was primarily because, as an engineer, I built the units library for TypeDB. And when I did that, I kind of did a bit of copying of what Dave had done on the units library, the units gist, because I found it very interesting. When you look at QUDT or, whether NASA effort or some of the other efforts, they're very, shall we say, academic, didn't seem too practical. And I really liked where Dave was coming with that. So I tend to work in sectors not so much in the total enterprise space, but more application specific, like building a causal troubleshooting chatbot, which I'm doing, and I'm working on a cybersecurity initiative. We've got I do process mining, a whole load of other fields. I've got quite a lot of fields that I'm interested in, and I must admit, I've never been a fan of binary edges. So I don't like property graphs, and I'm not too keen on RDFL either. I think it's quite a good idea for its time, but in my view, it's quite old-fashioned technology. And I'm interested in a democratization movement that makes reasoning and modeling less of an ivory tower thing. And as I was saying before, I'm interested in what I would call the next level above describing things with meaning, which is describing things by how they function or how they behave, particularly under the impact of time and a stimulus. And this is very much kind of like an engineering thing. You can't know a system by describing it with words. You've got to describe how it acts with regard to some impetus, some force, some movement, and everything interesting happens in time. And so hence my interest in process mining and these other things. And Graphql TypeDB is super interesting to me because it represents a new paradigm, so shall we say a new approach to modeling, entity relationship, strongly type focused, and the reasoning systems, some simple horn logic, basically when then rules, and it's a very interesting community to be part of. And I run a number of open source initiatives there. It is fully open source system. It's not so much a standard like a W3C standard, but it's fully open source, so that has a big open source community.
And so you're implying an interesting point, which is reasoning for the common person. And so we will see these events perhaps in Europe that are focused on reasoning, and they're very academic, and we're trying to get reasoning out of the university and into people's hands in some form or fashion. So, I mean, those of us in the RDF community are familiar with RDF Fox and Terminus DB, for example. I'm wondering if you could compare and contrast, and if there is a less steep on-ramp to what you're suggesting instead.
Well, I think one of the, when I, before I kind of hit Type DB, I'd done a lot of looking through RDFL. I like to trawl through scientific literature in lots of different fields. And, I've looked through a lot of different papers on RDFL. And so one of the interesting things is not so many systems actually do inferencing in RDFL. A lot are just linked data, which is fine.
Mm-hmm.
Semantics has value. But one of the other things is personally, I'm really disappointed with deduction, and I'd really like induction and abduction as well as calculation, because I'm an engineer and I like to calculate stuff. And so there was always a limitation in terms of, how I could take data. Can I pull it out of a dynamic simulation? How well can I model time? And how well can I calculate stuff was always a thing that I was interested in. And when I look around the world, when I model it using computational tools, it's real hard to model it using binary edges. So I was never really pleased with property graphs or RDFL. And so for these reasons, I kind of came across Graphql as it was in those days, and Type DB as I guess it's known now. And I found it to be quite a brave concept. It reminds me of some way about, like, why did NoSQL just explode on the scene? Like, why did all that happen? The answer was, well, RDBMS had kind of got into a real ivory tower. It was a bit hard to build complex systems. They had all these programmers out everywhere, didn't know how to build databases, and suddenly NoSQL made it super easy for them to do it. And it just blew the whole database field apart. And a lot of purists might go, oh, well, blah, 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 blah. But the truth is that it did go ballistic for those reasons. And, one of the things I like about Type DB is it is the type of thing, there's a level of complexity to it. I'm not saying your average JavaScript programmer can attempt it, but certainly it's moving towards a much simpler system, a more obvious syntax that can be looked at and understood without any kind of prior knowledge.
Yeah.
And a reasoning system that one could attempt on one's own. So I see it as a democratization tool for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know if the semantic arts folks have explored what you're talking about, Brett, or if they have thoughts on a reasoning track, for example, in one of our events.
So I must express support and excitement to hear that. I mean, because the initial drive to implement that at Graphql, came to a large extent from an RDF competitor, which is called Topic Maps. And Topic Maps is essentially a hypergraph. We have n-way relationships, and what Graphql did, and I was part of that in the first version, basically leading the team to develop the first version of what is now TidyDB and used to be Graphql, was very much inspired from that idea to have something highly structured, flexible, to have reasoning which supports recursion, which is more powerful than a lot of other reasoning engines, and that limitation of binary properties, we recognized, and we try to communicate, and we always struggled with, because you go to conference and you say, well, you can do end-to-end relationships, you have this and that, and people say, well, what is it used for? What good is it? And now, I guess 5-6 years later, when the whole field is exploding and people are realizing how limiting that is, I think that's kind of really great to hear, and to so yeah, great to hear that, Brett. Happy to
So
see that
Bart,
technology. Yeah. Sorry.
Hang on,
Boris? Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, Michael Sullivan's got his hand up. So
Okay.
Let's use the hand discipline here.
All right.
Assuming I can open the damn. Oh, there we go. Good. I've modeled some things in TypeDB, just kind of as kind of sketching, and I found it at first bewildering because, of course, it's very relation based versus entity based, but after a while it just became so fun and refreshing. If you're from the RDF side of the world, it's very familiar in the sense that you have to build a schema first. And so you define your types and your classes and all that stuff. And all of that looks very familiar. So, and it is not hard to jump into. Obviously, there's no easy way to move or migrate from one to the other. Particularly back, although I know Brett's working on that, but I really found it very refreshing, and I too second it. I think there's going to be a lot of movement in it.
And it sort of begs the question, Michael, how do we start using it with clients if it's so compelling? And Brett's got a number of clients. Just wondering about those who are committed to the standards and the stuff that's out there that's been put together already.
Yeah, I mean, you're dealing with a kind of I guess technically it's version 2.0, but it's still missing some big, some product, some feature, excuse me, which again Brett is working on, and being from Oracle, it would be very difficult for me to suggest another database when Oracle has both a property and an RDF solution. On the other hand, as part of a packaged solution, it wouldn't matter that it's got its own database, in which case I could then easily suggest it. So I think we're looking at the very early get on the ground floor a year of it, and so I don't think it's one of these things where, oh, can we start a project tomorrow? I think you could start a POC tomorrow, and with the expectation that over the next 6 months or so, maybe 9 months, maybe even 12 months, you could potentially go live at that point. And once you learn everything, right? I mean, there's so much to learn, right? It's a new architecture, it's a new way of doing things, blah blah blah. So.
Other thoughts on this topic? Yeah, go ahead, Brett.
Yeah, I think there's some great comments there. One of the things that kind of using Australianism pisses me off about property graphs. Sorry, I get kind of emotive about things, but not everything is an entity. As an engineer, when I look around, there's actually very few entities. Everything is nested subsystems. If I take a thermodynamic approach, the technically called holons, which are kind of subsystems with their own driving forces and their own optimization behavior, and in an ecosystem they all work together to create some outcome. So a lot of those things are not entities, yet if I use a property graph as an example, everything must be an entity. My feet are an entity, my hands are an entity, everything's an entity, but it's just actually not. And just to push along with what Borislav was saying, that is one of the really annoying things about binary edges, is it makes everything an entity. It tends to in your modeling, and you have all these entities all over the joint. One of the interesting things is to push along with Michael's point is you end up focusing on, so the other thing that's really cool about TypeDB is an attribute which is really a piece of data, is held uniquely. So if I have, for example, an IP address, only it's a guarantee of the database that if for every value of that IP address, it's only held once and it's linked to everything that uses it. So for example, in a cybersecurity type thing, I'm building the STIX 2.1 cybersecurity open source initiative. That's a game changer. If you've got a property graph and you've got underneath an entity some value, how do you then find out what other entities share that value, like a location, a name, or whatever? Well, I've got to search every entity in the graph. It's a nightmare. So this idea of property graphs is they're fully unnormalized, and it's a freaking nightmare. So I think property graphs are real bad. Well, the only good thing about property graphs is I work everything out through hops, but even that seems, and there's a lot of graph algorithms that use this kind of hop methodology, but it's not so strong on the semantic side.
Well, let's get some other folks in on that same topic there. I know Aura's got his hand up and has written about this sort of thing.
Yeah, I have a couple of comments. So one is this NoSQL was mentioned, and I think that I wouldn't be so excited about the whole NoSQL movement, because if you really look at it, what happened was that almost everything that was kind of good about databases got sacrificed on the altar of scalability, so to speak. So we threw away all kinds of things like schema, in the broad sense, and things like that. So I've never been terribly excited about the whole NoSQL movement. Now the other thing is that about property graphs versus RDF. So we have a project in our team to kind of find sort of a unifying solution for these two, so that we could do things like run Gremlin over RDF, for example, or whatever it is that you want to do, but sort of broadly interoperate. And one of the real challenges we find is that RDF, and I've spent more than 20 years listening to people kind of bitch about RDF, is that RDF is the only graph model we have that has solid formal semantics and a good formal definition. And when we have tried to do this unifying approach, the real challenge we have is that property graphs have no formal semantics. They're just like literal data structures, and people treat them like data structures. And so RDF and maybe OWL on top of that, however you want to look at it, is sort of more like a logical model. And property graphs are just a data structure. And when we try to do this unification, we have no idea how to treat the property graphs. I mean, we basically have to give them own semantics. So to the best of our ability, we have to guess what's going on there. And in some cases, and I'll just give an example. Last year, we implemented support for OpenCipher on our database, and the so-called specification of OpenCipher was sort of woefully inadequate to actually specify how OpenCipher works. And so we had to go and actually look at databases that implement Cypher and see, okay, what happens if I write a query like this? And then sort of think that maybe that's the correct behavior. So I think that, I mean, of course, all kinds of things can be said about RDF, but at least the thing that we managed to do with RDF is that we managed to define the thing formally, which then now enables us to do all kinds of other things with RDF.
Well, those are some good points, and Brett, we can use the next 5 minutes or so to discuss, and then we'll move on to the next topic.
Yeah, there's some really good points there. So I think, there's clearly a movement to merge property graphs or come up with a common query language for property graphs and RDFL. And, I guess I often ask Alan, when is a standard a benefit or a glass ceiling? And, this is a question I've actually come across just to answer Ora's question on schema. Okay, I hear you, but there's a lot of people that use JSON databases because they're fast and they can do things. I've even come across a domain where you can't build a schema for it, and that's in cybersecurity. If you're picking up, all the raw data from a cybersecurity application, you've got IP addresses, you've got different types of traffic, you've got DNSs, you've got such a complicated mix of changing data that it actually makes it very, very, very challenging to build a schema for it, because it's there's just so many concepts and changes in there when you look through all the layers of the protocols and everything that's involved. And so many of the systems that I've seen, they use a schema-less approach just simply so that they can just dump everything in there, and then they want to use a schema to reason over it. So I see kind of like different use cases here. I might want to reason over something and then I want a schema, but I want to just dump a whole lot of data into something very, very quickly, just in order to be able to capture it. And there does seem to be a use case.
This idea of schemaless I think this idea of having schemaless things is sort of a fallacy in some sense, that there's always a schema.
True.
Whether you admit that there's a schema or not, there is always a schema.
True that.
Sometimes the schema is only in your head, but the schema still exists. So
I guess let's change that concept from schema to infinitely varying schema, or no restrictions on the data shape that I can put in the database. And as you point out, there's always a schema in my code that interfaces to that. I've got to have a schema somewhere, whether it's implied or in my head. And I absolutely believe that, and you're very true there. So
I'm not advocating having a sort of a very restrictive schema, but I think it's better to have an explicit model of what your data looks like, rather than having the model buried either inside your code or inside your head.
Well, I think that we're being a bit monolithic here, if I could say, Aura. And when we're talking about NoSQL, we're really talking about less perishable information. The stuff that deserves the modeling that you're talking about is more on the permanent side. If you look at a continuum, the folks who are working with key value stores, for example, they've got data that they don't intend to really plant and let grow. They're not doing anything organic with it. They're just doing something simple and quick and dirty. So I think that there's a place for what you're talking about, but there's also a place for these other solutions. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, someone's got their hand up.
Michael.
No, Chris has his hand up.
Okay, Chris.
So shouldn't we maybe think in terms of schema being associated not with the data but with views? So you might have different people accessing and updating the data using different schema with different views on the same data.
Yeah, I was going to add the two things about TypeDB that I really, really like. One, the language itself, the query language, is a much higher level, and I do believe that citizen developers and citizen data scientists will actually be able to query against a TypeDB database. Take a look at the language, and you'll see how simple it is, clean it is, and abstract it is compared to either SQL or Sparkle or any others. And the other point I wanted to make is that I think it's very straightforward, given the requirement for an ontology, basically, to build anything in TypeDB, that basically semantics are already built into the thing. We just have to standardize on them. And that's another project that Brett and I are working on, which is trying to migrate the concepts of GIST over to TypeDB, so that people can simply add them to existing TypeDB installations. And so I do think semantics will come, and more importantly, it won't be an add-on. It's already built in to TypeDB. It just needs to be exploited. There won't be any changes to the product to make it work, and the language is much more approachable in terms of querying. So I think that part of it is huge, just to get developers on board more than anything, because so many developers I work with they just refuse to even consider Sparkle. They won't even consider it.
Yeah, I think it's a really valid point. And Dave, in terms of the May event, one of the big things we want to do is sort of open our community up to others who might not have otherwise thought about what we're trying to do. And so, do we take this direction to try to bring more people into the mix, or wondering about other directions that we could use to do the same thing?
Well, I think we want to stay true to the data-centric message. So there's some directions that just wouldn't work at all. It's not a technology thing, though. It's not TypeDB versus RDF so much, but it's really are you embracing this idea of data centricity?
Right. So there are all the principles that you've espoused that we need to get people on board with, but then there's the practicality that Brett has talked about, and so it's sort of like we have to bring the two together somehow and get people interested in both.
I will actually also comment to say that there is some, one of the things that Michael first got interested in I did a review of time and how I could make time a first-class partner in TypeDB. And there's a lot of data structures that I can build through its elegance that would be very hard to do in RDFL. I can do lists, dicts, I can do any of that kind of stuff. And there is this concept in TypeDB that by building greater intricacy at the low level, I have a lower complexity at the overall level. But to go along with what Michael said, it's easy to read and understand. So there's a democratization in terms of the syntax. And also I'd point out that type theory has taken over from set theory. So there's actually a powerful mathematical underpinning to all of this. And, I don't see it necessarily as trying to take over from RDFL, although obviously I have small dreams in that direction. But RDFL has a lot of, it's got a huge installed base. And what we're trying to do in the Radical TypeDB space is more democratize. I'm more focused on use cases, individual use cases like cybersecurity, like being able to do functional descriptions, process mining, troubleshooting, these types of things that are hard for most reasoning systems to do. So we're not looking to...
And I also think there's a room for both, because within any data silo, you really do have a closed world, and that is one of the blockers. That's why developers of applications have problems with open world concepts and set theory. And yet, if we wanted to envision an enterprise with lots of data silos, each of which has its own semantic closed world silo, and TypeDB would be ideal for that. And what would be ideal for our RDF would be, on top of all that, would be a semantic ontology that's open world. And so I can see using both. Honestly, I don't see it an either or thing at all.
No.
Yeah.
And I must admit, Dave, I've got great respect for what you guys are doing in enterprises. and the way that you're going about it. And as I've said, I'm focusing much more on specific use cases where I can create market advantage through better reasoning than can be done in any other tool. And and to go along with what Michael said, I guess the TypeDB community and tool sets, we don't have a good protege, for example. In fact, I've got a team building a protege for TypeDB as we speak. And, because I've never been happy with the visualization of graphs. I've always think it's could be a lot more imagination applied. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for the two things to work together. When we build our GIST initiative, it's the idea of it, as Michael had said, was to build a lingua franca and to have bidirectional exchange of concepts. But at the end of the day, we will have a simplified, more refined way of writing that. The RDFL's way of expressing things is verbose, and it doesn't need to be as elegant. In TypeDB, I can represent things in a much more intuitive and elegant way.
Yeah, but, I think that's the bottom line, and from your perspective, and I think it's a good perspective to have, and we'll be interested to hear how you're progressing with that. Peter, you had your hand up. I don't know if this is that's on this topic or a subsequent one, but go ahead.
So I want to wind back a little bit, and since I'm amongst friends, are developers really snowflakes, or do they really have a point? And with that in mind, also just to sort of point out the business about LinkML as being a kind of YAML serialization for the development and the interpretation and what have you of schemas. But I mean, if developers really have a point, then maybe what we should have is a unified way of addressing that, rather than to have a
thousand flowers blooming,
a range of different communities, each kind of like addressing it at different speeds and in different ways. Yeah.
And at next month's presentation, I'll give a little talk on how I see lowering the bar for developers to embrace RDF, and I'll give a couple different examples. So I believe we can get there. I believe we can.
Yeah, that'd be great. That sounds great.
And those patterns are already well established. I mean, the reality is that Facebook, etc., have shown that things like Graphql is superior to REST for building these highly interactive, highly scalable applications. So, this is where the market's moving. They don't want to be data scientists. They want to be front-end developers. And we should help them get there. And that's really part of our project.
Right. So what you're saying then, Michael, is that they really do have a point, and the current set of tools really are not good enough. Is that right?
I would say yes. At a minimum, I would like to see standards for REST interfaces on front of RDF databases, particularly those that use Shackle, because obviously those business object shapes are the kinds of things you want to fetch for an e-commerce application or whatever. If you get outside of pure information, like Wikipedia or whatever, most people aren't interested in the open world. They're interested in a very closed world. Here are all my products, here are all my customers, here are all my, whatever. And so they like the notion of business objects that have nicely defined shapes. And the combination of REST plus Shackle is, I believe, the killer app for RDF that will finally break down the walls and let developers finally say, great, I don't have to know anything about Sparkle or RDF or anything. I have a nice REST endpoint. I can deal with that.
Okay.
So
Thanks.
that begs the question, Michael. Should we be in our May event? Should we be talking about the next generation of APIs? Specifically, I'm thinking in Steve's terms with marketing and trying to get some more keywords there. But also, you mentioned the REST approach and GraphQL and can we make the API universe more friendly to us in some ways, or am I just barking up the wrong tree here?
Oh no, outside of modelers and ontologists and taxonomists, the rest of the world could care less about that stuff. They care about APIs. So if you say we have, and you already know, there's a couple RDF databases out there that have GraphQL. I think it's GraphDB and Stardust, right? I think both of them have GraphQL. So, how many have adopted that? I think probably not a lot, simply because, frankly, the developer world doesn't know about this stuff yet. And that's part of my job, is to help promote it within Oracle. And I think, all of these technologies, in the end, you don't want to be writing, as a developer, TypeDB, TypeQL queries into TypeDB, right? You want a data miner or an aggregator to do that for you and express them as either GraphQL or REST APIs. So even there, the pattern is exactly the same.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking that we've got basically a bunch of plumbers in our community, and yet we're talking about finished carpenters that we're trying to cater to. So when we talk to somebody like Jan Zossman, for example, he will say, well, I just don't really talk to the 20-somethings or the 30-somethings because they're not really focused on the larger scale integration challenges that we have to address with this technology. So,
and you said the key word. You said the keyword integration, right?
Yeah.
Front end developers don't do integrations, right? And if they do, that's breaking MVC, because you don't want the front end doing a control-like or model-like things, right? So by definition, we want them to stay in their little world. We don't want them to making decisions of, oh, I'll do a mashup in JavaScript and I'll ping this database over here and I'll ping that database over there. It's like, oh no, you're acting like a damn controller. Stop doing that.
Okay.
Right.
This sort of loops back to what you were beginning with, Dave. Do you want to sort of redirect us here?
Yeah, I was just wondering, as we're having this conversation, there's a line, but I don't know where it is. If we pander too much to developers, we'll eventually say that this whole data center thing is just a knowledge base, and it might as well be relational, because that's what developers like anyway. So, while we do want to acknowledge that there are developers out there and they will have something to contribute, I don't know where that line is. I don't want to get too developer centric, though, I guess would be my caution.
And I think that's the API first approach, because actually I don't know a lot of developers who like SQL at all. I know all of them, however, like REST, and some of them like GraphQL. So if an API first approach, which is an abstraction, is exactly the right way to go. In other words, in MVC, I'm either the control, or I'm as a developer, I'm either working on the controller or I'm working on the view, and I shouldn't have to worry about the model. The model should be abstracted. Right. I should be able to swap out the model, and the thing would just work, right? I mean, so that's the beauty, and that's why RDF's never going away. By the way, anybody who thinks that RDF is doomed, it's like no. Once you abstract it, it's unimportant to the person who's going to consume it.
So don't we also have, rather than an MVC, MVVM, which again kind of returns you to the model business?
Yeah, you're right. And then of course, let's be fair. I have yet to see in 25 years a single instance of pure MVC. everybody puts some of the control in their view. I mean, they all cheat.
Mm-hmm.
They all cheat, which is why I love RDF. I love the idea of putting inferencing and logic in the database. That's the right place for it, because the model should own all that.
And the other thing is that increasingly we're getting the ability to work in RDF right the way through to the browser, with the RDF JS, it's similar. And that means that you can actually have a local in-browser triple store to do all manner of different things, including our RL reasoning and Sparkle querying. So
I mean, I don't think it's going away. I think what's the headwaters we're seeing is that all of the money and interest has moved over back in 2006 or thereabouts to Neo4j, which said, screw all this semantic crap. Let's just model objects and say, oh, we can call this thing a property graph. And developers took one look at that and go, oh, I recognize that. That's an object. And and then bingo, that's what it was. Whereas in RDF, the idea of an object, especially a business object that people are used to, is like not really obvious, right? I mean, mostly because of the use cases like Wikipedia, et cetera, are more informational. So the uses, the tooling is fine, right? In the end, no matter whether you are RDMS or RDF or TypeDB, in the end, the consumers of that are going to want APIs in general, and they're going to want a REST or GraphQL or what 2 years from now the next version of it, right? I mean, it's that part can change.
What about making APIs more capable and more flexible? I mean, is that a direction that we could attack from the architecture perspective?
Well, so in a good, that's a great question. Most REST interfaces suck. So I mean, it's like, for example, the idea is great. There's this model, it's abstracted. I don't have to know about it. Well, it turns out you do need to know about it because you don't know what to query for. You can't even discover things, right? So this whole notion of being able to discover what you don't know is key. And there are ways to model things. I've documented it on some of my blogs, and I'll show that on March 1st. About ways you can model things so that developers can write generic code against any kind of thing and return the thing without having to know what the thing is.
Yep.
So there are ways to model these things, and it does get into modeling, unfortunately. Well, I shouldn't say unfortunately. It's like, oh, I have to add this. If I want to make this easy to consume, I now have to, I have to add these little hints in my model so that people can pick up on those hints. And you can even call them hint. This is a hint. This thing here is for you, Mr. Developer, and if you use this, you can write generic code.
So we're still in the middleware situation where a lot of us are having to sell in that fashion. We're not selling to the end users. We're selling to the folks that are going to be improving what ends up in the API, for example.
I would say that's the first hurdle, yes.
Yeah. So Steve, I'm sorry to tell you that we're still in the middleware game.
I don't know. We're trying to get out of that game. We're looking for sponsors that want business improvement.
Well, there are patterns that people can follow. These things just haven't been published and they aren't demonstrable yet. But I think you're about to see some, and I hope people can pick up on it.
I like how Dave's pretty focused on the money, really, and I think that's what I really liked about the Semantic Arts drive. Is it's really about the money, centralizing the data, having one store. These are all money-related things. But I'll also go along with what Michael Sullivan said. I think just developers why did Neo4j take off? because it was easy. And
Mhm.
there's just a huge, you know, if you look at any kind of like statistical breakdown, there is the bulk of the majority of programmers who just want it easy, and that's why no SQL. That's why Neo4j, you know, RDFL was there. Why did it never get huge? Well, I mean, it is relatively huge because it was hard, and I think that was, you know, people just want it easy. They're lazy. And I think this democratization thing is a bigger play than people think. So I like what you're saying about making it simpler to access RDFL stores, but I think it's always problematic for people to make their own RDFL database.
So can I ask, when you're talking about APIs here, are we talking about application APIs, in APIs that interact with some sort of a domain model directly, but not with RDF? An API which wouldn't know whether the underlying meta model is RDF or relational or whatnot. Is that?
Well, the actual connection will be to an RDF database, but the front end will look something like, give me all the red widgets, right? So, I mean, that's, you know, you're basically going to have a URL basically that has a pattern, and if you follow that pattern, then you'll get back a result set, which is a tabular form of data, which you can then you know, use as your JSON object, and from there on you can go to a Java object, and you're there. I mean, once you've got your objects in your code, you don't care how they got there.
Okay, so we're abstracting RDF away and turning it into some sort of a object model or object.
Well, when you're coding, yeah, you're dealing in Java. You're dealing with a thing called a POJA, a plain old Java object. So yeah, so that's you just. And it's the same thing with .NET. I mean, you know, what all developers want is a way of accessing the business objects, and then being able to identify the business objects, and then once they've got them, they can display them however they wish. Graphql goes a little further than that, because you can now define what you want returned. So instead of getting this big blob back, you can specify exactly what you want back. You know, I want the height, the eye color, and the hair color coming back. I don't want the, you know, the name or the whatever. So I mean, it's people really love that. I mean, in terms of developing, it's like, I don't want to have to deal with performance issues, because I don't want this giant blob coming back that's going to suck up all my memory and everything else, and also take a long time to transfer. So the benefit of GraphQL is that you can then specify exactly what you want to come back, and that's different than REST, because with REST you've got patterns, and those patterns return what they've returned because you've defined them. It's more of a waterfall model.
Is there an RDFL Tableau interface or something for that? Because I think there's a whole need for people not just to access stuff through APIs, but to be able to pull it straight into charts, because they can't be bothered doing the API work, or they don't know how. And so that's another democratization thing you might want to consider, making it easy to consume in tools like Tableau, etc.
Well, I think in general, Brett, we're lacking on the user experience front, and we always have been. And Dave, I don't know if trying to get more user experience savvy folks in the mix would help us, and if we can, or if they're just not interested in what we're talking about.
No, I think they'd be interested. And many people have done, you know, the Tableau to RDF and various other. I mean, it's not a huge shim. So yeah, you know, that should be in our toolkit for sure.
So we're close to the half hour, and I'm wondering what the takeaways are here. Any thoughts on what this means for the May event, or other things we should be addressing in our monthly meetings?
Well, I mean, yeah, there's huge deals with how do we create virtual views on existing relational data. I've told many people before, there's no customer that I've ever worked with is going to let you move their ERP data to something else. They're just not going to let it happen. But we know that a semantic view on that data could provide great insights. So, the whole notion of views into TypeDB, views into RDF, there's a whole bunch of people working on the RDF side. Nobody yet working on it on the TypeDB side. But don't move the data. Move the view basically is a big deal. And I think how we work with existing repositories, regardless of whether they're NoSQL or Hadoop or relational or JSON, it doesn't matter, right? If these things are really that big, if they're multi-terabytes, nobody's going to move them. They're just not going to move them. It's too expensive to move. And so we need ways of creating views, particularly semantic views, because everybody here recognizes that. And how we do that is a huge gap. It hasn't been particularly well filled. I mean, Oracle has a solution that's pretty, okay, but it's kind of slow and not super scalable. Other guys have tried stuff. I think some of the people involved with data.io are doing some of those things. So yeah, that's a whole, it gets into ETL, of course, too. But it's a huge topic. It's a huge topic.
I will say, Michael, that you prompted me to build a virtualization layer for TypeDB to connect on to Oracle Financials, because you asked me last year, is there a way of doing this and can you convert this SQL library? And I'm going to use the ORM modeling approach to reverse engineer that, because ORM's pretty powerful, not used that much, and I got an ORM engine, as you know. So yeah, we're going to crank away on that, because I think that's a huge opportunity to provide reasoning over an RDBMS through a virtualization layer. And you need a good comms way, and there's either use these kind of like Sparkle engines type thing or reverse engineering it through ORM.
And I do think the virtualization thread, Dave, and Steve has quite a bit of legs, and that Stardog has been heading in that direction too.
Yeah,
so
I mean, we've been using their stuff, and yeah, I think it's all going to be hybrid going forward.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
That's the world. The world is hybrid. That's correct.
Yep.
And multi-cloud.
Yep.
I mean, you're going to have your ERP on Oracle Cloud, and you're going to have your Microsoft Office on the Microsoft Cloud, Azure Cloud, right?
Yep.
I mean, it's just that's a fact. That's a fact.
Yep.
Any other thoughts before we sign off today? This has been a really good discussion. I want to thank Brett and Michael in particular and Aura as well for weighing in on and adding their thoughts. Really helpful.
Yep. And Michael, so you're up for March. James, do you want to make sure we got that a good write-up for that and people know it's coming?
Yep, I will touch base with Michael, send you a quick email and make sure I'm clear.
Right.
Yeah, I sent the bio the other day, so I assume you all got it.
Yep, I received it, Michael. So I believe that current update is on the website. I'll have to just confirm that with our webmaster.
Thanks for letting me present, guys. I'm a bit of a rebel, and I'm glad that you were able to not get too offended by my rebellious opinions. But, you've got to have the innovators out there at the front end trying to do things differently, even if we fail. And to want to innovate, then I've got to be unhappy with what is currently there. Otherwise, I wouldn't innovate. So
Yeah.
I hope
Well,
I
guess you're
offended by those, Mel.
Yeah. No, I guess you're the rebels rebel because you're in amongst the rebels anyway. This is not the status quo. Yeah, this is not the status quo here.
No, well, I also like what you had to say, Dave, about how they're working together. As you know, this GIST thing that we want to be able to get this kind of communication going between TypeDB and RDFL. There's too much RDFL for me to totally replace it, even in my wildest dreams. But I won't say that I don't have initiatives underway, but I do like the working together approach, and I'm keen for collaborations that particularly revolve around money-making opportunities, just like you do with your data-centric model, right? It's a great idea. Your modelling technique's brilliant. I'd like to do some things that could be as good.
And I'd like to propose that we have a session where everybody on this call tries to convince Brett of the validity and utility of URIs.
Good luck with that one.
Hey, I just suggested to a monolith on a re-architecture is that if they're going to break up the database and make it into microservices, they should be putting everything with the URIs. Yeah. And they said that's a good idea. So I mean, there's a real reason for URIs.
Yeah.
All right, I remain to be convinced, but I'm open to scientific facts very much. Thanks very much for everybody.
Yeah, thanks again, everybody. Thanks for joining, and look forward to next month's, and we'll try to be more together next time.
All right.
Thanks for inviting me, Alan.
Bye.